Hey Reddit, my name is Michael. I'm 38 years old. And if someone had told me a year ago that I'd be here, spilling my life story to strangers, I would have laughed. But here I am, trying to piece together the shattered remains of what I thought was a perfect marriage. My wife, Rebecca, and I have been together for 12 years. We have two amazing kids, Ethan, 10, and Lily, 7, and I genuinely thought we were a team. Turns out I was wrong. It started small. Rebecca had always been independent and busy, juggling her career, the kids, and her hobbies. I admired that about her. But about a year ago, she seemed to start pulling away. She was going out more often, work dinners, new yoga classes, wine nights with friends. At first, I didn't think much of it. She deserved to unwind after everything she did for our family. But then the excuses got weird. One Saturday morning, Rebecca told me she was heading out to help her friend Laura move into a new apartment. It sounded believable enough. Laura's the kind of friend who's always in transition. But when I ran into Laura at the grocery store later that day, she casually mentioned that her move wasn't happening until next weekend. I brushed it off as a mix-up. Rebecca was probably just helping someone else. But it left a knot in my stomach I couldn't untangle. Then there was the bracelet. Rebecca came home one evening wearing a sleek silver bracelet with a charm dangling from it. It wasn't her usual style. Rebecca's more into chunky, bold jewelry, but when I complimented it, she barely glanced at it. "Oh, this old thing? I've had it forever," she said, waving me off. Funny, because I'd never seen it before. When I asked Ethan if he remembered seeing it, he shrugged and said, "Mom said a friend gave it to her last week." Then knot in my stomach got tighter. Things escalated when Rebecca started taking these weekend workshops for personal development. One Friday evening, as she was packing her bag, I asked her where this week's session was being held. She rattled off the name of a conference center 2 towns over. Later that evening, out of curiosity, I looked up the schedule for the place. There wasn't any workshop, just a wedding booked for the weekend. I didn't confront her, not yet, but the cracks in her stories were getting harder to ignore. One evening, when Rebecca was out, running errands, our neighbor Doug stopped by to return a ladder he'd borrowed. While we were chatting, he casually mentioned seeing Rebecca earlier that afternoon at a cafe downtown with some guy. "Figured it was one of her co-workers or something," Doug said. My chest tightened as I forced a laugh and changed the subject. For the next week, I couldn't focus on anything else. Rebecca's late nights, her vague explanations, the way she seemed to avoid eye contact. It all started to feel like pieces of a puzzle I didn't want to solve. But I had to know. One way or another, I needed the truth. And so, the stage was set. I didn't realize it then, but my entire world was about to be turned upside down. After that conversation with Doug, I couldn't stop myself from noticing the patterns. Rebecca's calendar became a maze of meetings, errands, and workshops that always seemed to shift or disappear when I tried to follow up. She claimed she was busier than ever at work, yet her paycheck hadn't changed in months. The kids, thankfully, didn't seem to notice. Ethan was too wrapped up in his soccer games, and Lily was busy drawing masterpieces on every scrap of paper in the house. But I felt like I was losing control of everything. My mind ran in circles, searching for logical explanations, excuses, anything that could prove I was just overthinking this. Then came the pivotal moment. It was a rainy Thursday afternoon, and I had left work early to surprise Rebecca with lunch. She had mentioned being tied up in a meeting at one of her clients' offices downtown, and I figured showing up with her favorite sandwich might earn me some brownie points. I even brought flowers. When I arrived at the building, I noticed something odd right away. Her car wasn't in the lot. I thought maybe she'd parked somewhere else, but as I walked inside, I was greeted by an unfamiliar receptionist. "Hi," I said, smiling awkwardly. "I'm looking for Rebecca Carter. She said she'd be here for a meeting." The receptionist blinked. "I'm sorry, but we don't have anyone by that name scheduled today. Are you sure it's this location?" The knot in my stomach returned with a vengeance. I stammered out something about checking the address and walked back to my car, the rain soaking through my jacket. For a moment, I just sat there, staring at the windshield as droplets streaked down the glass. She wasn't here. Where was she? I decided to drive. I didn't have a plan, just a growing urge to keep moving. About 20 minutes later, as I was passing through the next town over, I spotted her car. It was parked outside a cozy little cafe, the kind of place she loved but never mentioned visiting anymore. My heart started pounding. I parked a few spaces away and stepped out, my pulse racing as I approached the window. Inside, Rebecca was sitting at a corner table, laughing over coffee with a man I didn't recognize. He was tall, clean-cut, dressed in business casual. She was leaning in, her hand brushing his arm as they talked. I froze. It was like watching a stranger. They weren't being overly affectionate. No holding hands, no stolen kisses. But there was an ease between them that I hadn't seen in years. My wife looked happy, carefree, the way she used to look with me. I wanted to storm in and confront her right then and there, but something held me back. I couldn't make a scene, not without knowing what I was walking into. Instead, I snapped a quick photo through the window, proof just in case, and hurried back to my car before they saw me. The drive home was a blur. My mind raced with questions. Who was he? Was this innocent? Why hadn't she told me about him? I tried to convince myself it was nothing, just a work friend, someone she could confide in. But deep down, I knew better. That night, Rebecca came home late, claiming she'd been stuck in traffic. She didn't seem flustered, didn't even notice the tension in my voice as I asked her how her day had been. I watched her closely during dinner, searching for any cracks in her story, but she was calm, collected, and, most disturbingly, normal. I didn't sleep much that night. Instead, I stared at the photo on my phone, trying to make sense of what I'd seen. The pieces of the puzzle were starting to come together, and I couldn't shake the feeling that I was about to uncover something I'd never be able to unsee. But if she thought she could keep lying to me, she was wrong. It was time to dig deeper. The morning after spotting Rebecca at the cafe, I felt like I was carrying a lead weight around my chest. I couldn't bring myself to confront her yet. I needed more clarity, more proof. If I went in guns blazing and was wrong, I'd never forgive myself. So, I played it cool. Rebecca, on the other hand, was anything but. She came home that evening in a flurry of chaos, dropping her bag on the kitchen counter and practically collapsing into a chair. Her hair was messy, her face slightly flushed, and her eyes darted nervously as she caught her breath. "Michael," she gasped, "you won't believe what happened to me today." I raised an eyebrow, trying to appear calm despite the firestorm brewing inside me. "What happened?" I was almost robbed," she stammered, her voice shaky. "I was walking back to my car after my meeting, and this guy came out of nowhere. He grabbed my arm and demanded my purse. But I don't know how I managed to get away and run to safety." She looked at me, waiting for a reaction, her hands trembling ever so slightly. "What?" I said, my voice flat with disbelief. "Are you okay? Did you call the police?" She hesitated just for a second, but I caught it. "No." I was too scared. I just wanted to get out of there as fast as I could. Something about her story didn't sit right with me. Rebecca's always been tough, the kind of person who prides herself on being prepared for anything. If someone really tried to rob her, she'd have gone straight to the cops, or at least told me immediately. But instead, she sat there spinning this wild tale, her eyes darting around like she was searching for the next piece of the puzzle she was making up on the spot. "I'm glad you're okay," I said carefully, masking my skepticism. "Where did this happen?" She flinched just barely. "Downtown, near that conference center I told you about." I leaned back in my chair, crossing my arms. "That's terrible, but wasn't the meeting canceled? You said so earlier this week." Her eyes widened for a split second, and then she recovered with a nervous laugh. "All right. The meeting was canceled at the last minute. I just didn't have time to update you. I went to grab coffee instead, and that's when it happened." I nodded slowly, playing along, even as my stomach churned. Her story had more holes than Swiss cheese, but I couldn't let her see that I knew. "You should be more careful," I said, standing to clear my plate. "Maybe carry pepper spray or something. And next time, call me right away." I would have come to help. Rebecca gave me a weak smile. "You're right. Just paniqued. Igus." I'm still shaken up. She wasn't shaken. She was lying. I could feel it in my gut, and I hated that I had to sit there pretending to believe her. But her excuse wasn't just flimsy, it was desperate. Whatever she was hiding, she must have been afraid I was getting too close to the truth. That night, As she sat on the couch scrolling through her phone, I replayed the events in my head. Her rushed entrance, the way she spun that robbery story, the slip about the meeting cancellation, it all screamed cover-up. I didn't need her phone or text to confirm my suspicions anymore. I needed a plan. Rebecca didn't realize it yet, but she'd just tipped her hand. Whatever game she was playing, I was done sitting on the sidelines. It was time to figure out who that man at the cafe was and what was really going on behind her perfectly polished facade. The pieces of the puzzle were starting to fall into place, and I knew the next move was mine. The next morning, I woke up feeling more determined than ever. I needed to figure out who this man was. The thought of Rebecca with someone else had kept me up all night, and the memory of him kissing her cheek played in my mind on an endless loop. Was it innocent? Was it romantic? Who was he? I didn't have much to go on. Just the image of his face burned into my memory and the hotel where I'd seen them together. But that was enough. After dropping the kids off at school, I decided to head to the hotel. If Rebecca wasn't going to give me answers, I'd find them myself. I walked into the lobby, trying to look like I belonged, and approached the front desk. "Excuse me," I said, flashing a polite smile. "I think I might have left my wallet here last night. I was meeting my sister and her friend. She introduced him as Nick, but I didn't catch his last name. Any chance you have a guest with that name?" The receptionist glanced at her computer. "I'm sorry, sir. We can't share guest information." It was a long shot, but it still stung. I muttered a quick thank you and left, frustrated. As I sat in my car, brainstorming my next move, a thought hit me. Rebecca's family. Rebecca didn't talk much about her extended family. I knew she had a brother named Nicholas, or Nick, but he'd never been around. She mentioned once that he lived out of state and that they'd grown apart over the years. The idea of it being him seemed ridiculous at first. Why would she hide meeting her own brother? And why would he kiss her like that? I couldn't shake the possibility, so I started digging. I scrolled through Rebecca's social media, looking for anything that might confirm my suspicions. There wasn't much. Rebecca wasn't big on posting about her personal life. But then I found it, an old photo from years ago of Rebecca with a man who looked eerily similar to the one I'd seen. The caption read, "Family first. Love you, Nick." I stared at the screen, my stomach twisting into knots. Could it really be him? And if so, why the secrecy? Why the hotel meetings? That night, I decided to test the waters. Over dinner, I casually brought up the subject of her family. "Hey, Rebecca," I said, trying to sound nonchalant. "Have you talked to your brother Nick lately?" Her fork froze mid-air for a split second before she set it down. "Oh, no, not really." "Why?" I shrugged. "Just curious. You haven't mentioned him in a while." She smiled tightly. "Yeah, we don't really keep in touch much. He's busy with work and everything." Her response felt rehearsed, like she was trying too hard to brush it off. But I didn't push. I just nodded and went back to eating, filing away the information for later. A few days later, I got my answer. Rebecca left her laptop open on the kitchen counter while she was putting the kids to bed. I wasn't proud of myself, but I couldn't resist. I opened her email and searched for Nick's name. There was a string of messages between them, dated over the last few months. They weren't romantic or overly emotional, but there was something off about the tone. They were close, closer than she'd ever let on. And one line stood out to me, haunting me long after I'd closed the laptop. "I've missed you so much, Nick. Being with you feels like home." I didn't know what to think. On the surface, it could have been innocent, but paired with everything else, the secret meetings, the kiss, the lies, I couldn't ignore the nagging feeling that something wasn't right. If Nick was just her brother, why was she hiding him from me? Why was she meeting him in secret, at a hotel of all places? And why did she seem so nervous when I brought him up? The pieces weren't adding up, and I had a sinking feeling that this was just the beginning. Whatever Rebecca was hiding, it was bigger than I ever imagined. And I wasn't sure I was ready to face the truth. The revelation about Nick left me spinning. If this man at the hotel was truly Rebecca's brother, then what the hell was she hiding? The secrecy, the way she dodged questions, the strange affection, they didn't feel like the actions of someone reconnecting with family. They felt like something much darker. I spent the next few days observing Rebecca more closely than ever. Every phone call she took in another room, every sudden outing, every excuse. Everything felt like a piece of a puzzle I wasn't sure I wanted to complete. One evening, I decided to test the waters again. We were sitting on the couch, watching a show, when I casually turned to her and said, I was thinking about that time we visited your parents. Weren't they talking about Nick moving back to town? Rebecca stiffened. She didn't turn to look at me. Oh yeah, maybe. But he's always so busy. You know how he is. How is he? I pressed gently, keeping my tone light. She glanced at me briefly, her smile strained. Nick's just complicated. He likes his privacy. Privacy. The word echoed in my head as I nodded, pretending to let the subject drop. I felt like I was living with a stranger, someone who was carefully constructing walls around herself that I wasn't allowed to breach. That Friday, Rebecca left for one of her weekend workshops again. She had her overnight bag, kissed the kids goodbye, and drove off with a bright smile, promising she'd be back by Sunday evening. I didn't believe her for a second. I called my buddy Sean, one of the few people I trusted completely, and told him I needed a favor. Sean worked in tech and knew his way around surveillance equipment. I asked him if he had anything that could help me figure out what Rebecca was up to. Man, this doesn't sound good, Sean said, his voice full of concern. It's not, I admitted, but I need answers. By the time Rebecca got back, I had a GPS tracker installed on her car. I hated myself for it, but I didn't see any other way to get the truth. The betrayal I felt wasn't just from her actions. It was from the lies she told so effortlessly. If she couldn't give me honesty, I'd have to find it myself. The next weekend, Rebecca announced she'd be out again, this time for a spa retreat with her friends. I nodded, pretending to be supportive, while my phone buzzed in my pocket, tracking her every move. To my surprise, she didn't go downtown or to a hotel. She drove out of town entirely, stopping at a small cabin in the woods about an hour away. I sat in my car, parked at a safe distance, watching as Rebecca stepped out with Nick by her side. He was carrying her bag, his arm brushing against hers as they walked toward the cabin. There was no hesitation, no awkwardness, just an ease between them that didn't sit right with me. The cabin lights came on, and for hours, I sat there in silence, watching shadows move behind the curtains. My mind raced, trying to make sense of what I was seeing. Was this just a sibling reunion? Or was it something else entirely? At one point, I saw them step onto the porch. Rebecca was laughing, her head thrown back in a way I hadn't seen in years. Nick leaned in, brushing a strand of hair from her face before pulling her into a hug. It wasn't the hug that bothered me. It was the way she held on, her hands gripping his back as if letting go was impossible. I couldn't stay any longer. My stomach churned as I drove back home, my mind a whirlwind of anger, confusion, and disbelief. This wasn't just about secrecy anymore. Rebecca was hiding something, and whatever it was, it involved Nick in a way that felt far from normal. I had my suspicions, but I needed more than shadows and feelings. If I was going to confront her, I needed undeniable proof. Because what I feared most wasn't just that Rebecca was lying to me. It was that the lies ran far deeper than I could have ever imagined. After that night at the cabin, I couldn't shake the image of Rebecca and Nick on the porch. Her laughter, the way she clung to him. It gnawed at me, refusing to let go. Every instinct in my body screamed that something was horribly wrong. The next day, I dropped the kids off at school and called Sean again. I filled him in on everything I'd seen, trying to keep my voice steady. "Mike," he said after I finished, "are you sure you're ready for what you might find? If this is as bad as you think it is, there's no going back once you know." I took a deep breath. I have to know. I can't live like this. Sean agreed to help me dig deeper. He suggested starting with Nick. I knew next to nothing about him, aside from Rebecca's vague mentions over the years. Sean, however, had access to resources I didn't. It didn't take long for him to find something. That evening, he called me, his voice tense. "Mike, you're not going to like this." "What is it?" I asked, my heart racing. "Nick Carter has a criminal record," Sean said. "Mostly minor stuff, bar fights, reckless driving, but there's one thing that stands out. About 6 years ago, he was arrested for public indecency. Charges were dropped, but the circumstances were unusual." "Unusual how?" "C'est inquisitif." The report mentioned a woman, but the details are sealed. Whatever happened, it was serious enough to get the cops involved. My mind raced. Why hadn't Rebecca? ever mentioned this. If Nick had a history like this, why was she so eager to keep him close? I spent the rest of the night combing through old family photos and emails, looking for any clues I might have missed. Most of it was mundane, holiday pictures, birthday parties, the usual, but then I found something odd. It was a photo from years ago, long before we were married. Rebecca and Nick were standing side by side, arms around each other, smiling at the camera. But it wasn't the pose that caught my attention. It was the caption written in Rebecca's handwriting. "Forever my first love." I stared at the words, my hands trembling. First love? What did that mean? I couldn't shake the sinking feeling in my chest. Everything I'd seen, everything I'd felt, it all pointed to something I didn't want to believe. Could it really be possible that Rebecca and Nick's relationship wasn't just familial? Was there something darker, hiding beneath the surface? The thought made me sick to my stomach, but I couldn't ignore the signs any longer. The next day, I decided to confront Rebecca. Not about everything, just enough to see if she'd crack. That evening, after the kids were in bed, I sat down across from her at the kitchen table. She looked up from her phone, surprised by my serious tone. "We need to talk," I said. She tilted her head, her expression cautious. "Okay, what's on your mind?" "I know you've been seeing Nick," I said bluntly. "I saw you at the cabin." Her face froze, and for a moment, she didn't say anything. Then she laughed nervously. "Oh, Mike, you're being ridiculous. Nick's my brother. Of course I've been seeing him. We're family. Family doesn't hide from each other," I said, my voice cold. "You've been lying to me, Rebecca, and I want to know why." Her smile faltered. "I haven't been lying," she said, her tone defensive. "Nick's just complicated. He's been going through a lot, and I didn't want to drag you into it." "Going through what?" I pressed. She hesitated, and for a moment, I thought she might tell me the truth. But instead, she shook her head and stood up, crossing her arms. "You don't understand," she snapped. "Nick and I have a bond you could never get. He's been there for me in ways you never were." Her words cut deeper than I expected, but they also confirmed my worst fears. Whatever this bond was, it wasn't normal. It wasn't healthy. I stood up, my hands clenched into fists. "I don't know what's going on between you and Nick," I said, my voice shaking, "but I'm going to find out. And when I do, there'll be no more hiding." She stared at me, her jaw tight, before turning and walking out of the room without another word. I watched her go, my chest tight with anger and betrayal. The walls were closing in, and I could feel the truth waiting just beyond my reach. But I wasn't going to stop until I uncovered every dark secret Rebecca had buried. The days after my confrontation with Rebecca were tense, to put it lightly. She avoided me as much as possible, and when we did speak, it was in clipped, polite tones that felt more like two strangers sharing a space than a married couple. It was like the life we'd built together was collapsing around us, piece by piece, and neither of us wanted to acknowledge the rubble. But I couldn't let it go. The image of her at the cabin with Nick kept flashing in my mind, paired with that cryptic caption from her old photo. "Forever my first love." The words haunted me. Were they just a weird way of expressing closeness to her brother? Or was there something far more sinister behind them? I didn't have the answers, but I knew one thing. Rebecca wasn't going to give them to me willingly. If I wanted the truth, I'd have to find it myself. Sean came through for me again. He'd managed to find an old social media account of Nick's, inactive for years, but still full of posts. As I scrolled through, a disturbing pattern began to emerge. There were photos of him and Rebecca together. Not just the typical family snapshots, but pictures that felt intimate. Them sitting close on a beach, Rebecca leaning her head on his shoulder. Him kissing her on the cheek with captions like "Nothing compares to you" and "My partner in crime." My chest tightened as I scrolled further. One post, from years before Rebecca and I even met, caught my eye. It was a blurry photo of what looked like a bonfire, with the caption, "One day, we'll escape all of this and be free. Just you and me, like it was always meant to be." I couldn't breathe. It was one thing to suspect something was off, but this felt like confirmation of my worst fears. I confronted Sean about it, needing someone to ground me. "Am I crazy?" I asked, pacing back and forth in his living room. "Could this just be some weird sibling thing I don't understand? Or am I looking at something wrong?" Sean rubbed the back of his neck, his face grim. Mike, I don't want to jump to conclusions, but it doesn't look good. Those posts, the way she's been acting, it all points to something more than just a sibling relationship. I sank into the couch, my head in my hands. I don't even know who I'm married to anymore. Sean put a hand on my shoulder. You need to be careful. If this goes deeper than you think, confronting her could push her into a corner. You need concrete proof before you make your move. He was right. As much as I wanted to storm back home and demand answers, I knew Rebecca would just twist the truth or shut down completely. I had to be smarter than that. That evening, while Rebecca was out again, I searched the house for anything that might give me more insight. I rifled through drawers, checked her nightstand, and even looked through her old photo albums. Nothing. It wasn't until I opened the box in the back of our closet, the one labeled keepsakes, that I found it. Inside were old letters, carefully folded and tied together with a faded ribbon. They were addressed to Rebecca, but the handwriting was unfamiliar. I opened the first one, my hands shaking, and started to read. My dearest Becca, every day apart from you feels like a lifetime. I can't wait until we can be together again, just the two of us. You're the only person who truly understands me, the only one I'll ever need. I love you more than words can say. Forever yours, Nick. My stomach churned as I read letter after letter, each one more damning than the last. They weren't recent, most were dated over a decade ago, but they painted a picture I couldn't ignore. Nick's feelings for Rebecca weren't brotherly. They were romantic, intense, obsessive, and worse, Rebecca's replies, written on separate sheets tucked into the same bundle, mirrored his tone. She called him her soulmate, her safe place, the person she could never truly live without. I sat on the floor, the letters scattered around me, my mind racing. This wasn't just an affair. This wasn't just betrayal. This was something darker, something I wasn't prepared to face. I didn't know what my next move was, but one thing was clear. The life I thought I had was a lie, and the woman I thought I knew had been hiding the truth from me for years. The discovery of the letters left me numb. I stayed up the entire night, sitting on the floor of our bedroom, staring at the damning pieces of paper that had upended my reality. I couldn't think straight, couldn't figure out my next move. How do you confront someone about something this twisted? By morning, I was running on pure adrenaline. Rebecca had no idea what I'd found, and I wasn't sure if I was ready to let her know. I needed time to think, but life didn't wait for me to catch up. The kids were up early, their laughter echoing down the hallway as they got ready for school. Rebecca, as usual, was cheerful and composed, making pancakes and chatting about her plans for the day. Watching her act so normal, so innocent, made my blood boil. "Morning," she said brightly, handing me a plate of pancakes. I grunted in response, unable to meet her eyes. The tension must have been obvious, because as soon as the kids were out the door, Rebecca turned to me, her brow furrowed. "Are you okay? You've been acting strange lately." The irony of her question almost made me laugh. "I'm fine," I said curtly, grabbing my jacket. "Just tired." I left the house without another word, needing to get away before I said something I couldn't take back. But as I drove aimlessly around town, trying to clear my head, my phone buzzed with a call from an unknown number. "Hello," I answered hesitantly. "Is this Michael Carter?" A deep, unfamiliar voice asked. "Yes. Who is this?" "This is Detective Sanders with the county sheriff's office. I'm calling in regard to Nicholas Carter." My breath caught. "Nick? What about him?" "We've been investigating a string of fraud cases linked to his name. We believe he's been involved in several identity theft schemes and financial scams over the last 5 years. We were hoping you could help us with some questions." "Fraud? Scams?" I blinked, trying to process the detective's words. This wasn't what I expected at all. I don't know how I can help," I stammered. "We understand your wife has been in contact with him recently," the detective continued. "There's evidence suggesting she may have been involved, even if unknowingly. We'd like to know if you've noticed anything unusual about her finances or behavior." My mouth went dry. Rebecca? Involved in scams? The pieces started clicking into place. The secrecy, the hotel meetings, the stolen moments. It wasn't just about their relationship. There was something bigger at play. "Can I call you back?" I asked, barely keeping my voice steady. Of course. Please let us know if you come across anything that might help, the detective said before hanging up. I sat there in stunned silence, my hands gripping the steering wheel. This wasn't just a betrayal of our marriage. It was a betrayal of everything I thought I knew about Rebecca. Had she been lying to me for more than just her feelings for Nick? Was she hiding a criminal side I never saw coming? I drove home, my mind racing. When I walked in the door, Rebecca was in the kitchen, sipping her coffee like nothing was wrong. "Hey," she said, smiling at me. "You're back early." I stared at her, the weight of everything I'd learned crashing down on me. My voice was cold and steady as I asked, "Rebecca, is there something you need to tell me about Nick?" Her smile froze. For the first time in weeks, I saw a genuine fear flash across her face. "What are you talking about?" she asked, her tone defensive. "Don't play dumb." I snapped. "I just got a call from the police. They're investigating him for fraud. They think you might be involved." Her coffee cup slipped from her hand, shattering on the floor. For a moment, she just stood there, staring at the mess, before looking up at me with wide, panicked eyes. "Michael," she said, her voice trembling, "I can explain, but I wasn't sure I wanted to hear it." "Explain?" I repeated, my voice louder than I intended. "Explain what, Rebecca? That you've been sneaking around with your brother, lying to me, and now the cops think you're part of some criminal scheme? What exactly do you want to explain first?" Rebecca looked like a deer caught in headlights, her face pale and her hands trembling as she crouched to pick up the broken pieces of her coffee cup. She wasn't moving to clean up the mess. She was stalling, and we both knew it. "Michael," she said finally, her voice barely above a whisper. "It's not what you think." "Then tell me what it is," I demanded, crossing my arms. "Because from where I'm standing, it looks like you've been lying to me about everything." She stood up slowly, brushing her hands on her jeans. "I didn't want you to know because I thought I could fix it before it got out of control," she began, her voice shaking. "Nick came to me months ago. He said he was in trouble, that he'd gotten involved with some bad people and needed my help. I couldn't just turn him away." "Your help?" I said, incredulous. "What does that even mean? What did you do for him?" Rebecca hesitated, biting her lip as if deciding how much to reveal. "He needed money," she said finally. "A lot of money. I didn't give him any, I swear, but I let him use my name, just to open an account. He promised he'd sort it all out and pay it back before anyone noticed." My stomach twisted. "You let him use your name for fraud?" "I didn't know it was fraud at the time," she shouted, her composure breaking. "He told me it was temporary, that it was to cover a debt, and I believed him. He's my brother, Michael. What was I supposed to do? Maybe not commit a crime for him?" I shot back, my anger bubbling over. "Do you even hear yourself? And what about the hotel? The cabin? What were those, some kind of family meetings to brainstorm more scams?" Rebecca flinched as if I'd slapped her. "It wasn't like that," she said, tears streaming down her face. "I didn't know how deep he was into this. He told me everything was fine, but then he started asking for more." "More what?" I asked, though I wasn't sure I wanted to hear the answer. Her voice cracked as she said attention. He wanted me to drop everything for him, to come see him whenever he needed me. He said he had no one else, and I felt guilty. I thought I owed him. "Owed him what?" I said, my voice dropping to a cold whisper. "What are you not telling me, Rebecca?" She collapsed into a chair, her head in her hands. For a long moment, the only sound was her muffled sobs. When she finally spoke, her words were barely audible. "He's not just my brother, Michael," she said, her voice trembling. When we were younger, before I met you, things between us got complicated. My entire body went cold." "Complicated?" She looked up at me, her eyes pleading. "It was a mistake. We were kids, we didn't know what we were doing, and it ended before it even began. But Nick, he never let it go. He's always seen me as more than just a sister." I stared at her, my heart pounding in my ears. "You're telling me that this whole thing is because he's still in love with you?" She nodded, her tears falling freely now. "I thought I could handle it, that I could keep him at arm's length. But he's manipulative, Michael. He knows how to get under my skin, how to make me feel responsible for him." I felt like the ground had been ripped out from under me. Everything I thought I knew about my wife, my family, my life, it was all a lie. "And what about you?" I asked, my voice shaking with anger. Do you still have feelings for him? Rebecca froze, her silence speaking volumes. I couldn't stay in that room any longer. Without another word, I grabbed my keys and walked out the door, the sound of Rebecca's sobs echoing behind me. I didn't know where I was going, but I knew one thing for sure. There was no coming back from this. I drove aimlessly for hours, the car a prison of my own spiraling thoughts. Rebecca's confession replayed in my head over and over, each word cutting deeper than the last. Her relationship with Nick, her involvement in his schemes, her silence. All of it felt like an avalanche, burying me in doubt, anger, and betrayal. I ended up parked on a quiet road by the lake, a place I used to go to clear my head when we first got married. Back then, it had been a sanctuary, a reminder of all the dreams we'd had for our future. Now it felt like a cruel reminder of what I'd lost. I stayed there until the sun began to set, the glow of dusk casting long shadows on the water. My phone buzzed on the seat next to me, lighting up with Rebecca's name. I ignored it. Then came the text. Rebecca, Michael, please come home. Rebecca, we need to talk about this. Rebecca, I'm scared. Nick knows I told you. That last message sent a chill down my spine. Nick knew? How? My fingers hovered over the keyboard before I typed back. What do you mean? Her reply came almost instantly. He called me after you left. He's angry. I don't know what he's going to do. The anger I'd felt earlier was replaced by a cold dread. Nick wasn't just some distant figure anymore. He was a direct threat to my family. I called Sean. Mike, he answered, his voice tense. What's going on? It's worse than I thought, I said, explaining everything Rebecca had told me. Nick knows she told me. She says he's mad, and I don't know what he's capable of. Sean cursed under his breath. This guy sounds unstable. You need to be careful. If he's already involved in fraud, who knows what else he's willing to do? What do? I asked, desperation creeping into my voice. First, get your kids out of the house, Sean said. If this guy's dangerous, you don't want them anywhere near him. Then you need to call the cops. Tell them everything. I hesitated. Calling the police felt like crossing a line, like turning this already twisted situation into something far worse. But Sean was right. This wasn't just about Rebecca's lies anymore. This was about protecting my family. I drove straight to my parents' house, where Ethan and Lily were spending the night. My mom opened the door, her smile fading when she saw the look on my face. Michael, what's wrong? I need the kids to stay here for a few days, I said, brushing past her into the living room. Of course, she said, her concern growing. Are you and Rebecca okay? We're fine, I lied. Just a lot going on. I didn't stay long, knowing the kids would ask questions I wasn't ready to answer. Once I was sure they were safe, I drove home. Rebecca was waiting for me, pacing the living room. The second I walked through the door, she rushed over, grabbing my arm. Michael, I don't know what to do, she said, her voice trembling. He's not answering my calls now. I'm afraid he's going to do something stupid. I pulled away from her, my anger bubbling back to the surface. Do you even hear yourself? This is all because of you. You dragged us into this mess, and now you're surprised it's blowing up in your face. Her face crumpled, but I didn't care. I wasn't ready to comfort her, not after everything she'd done. I'm calling the police, I said, grabbing my phone. Wait, Rebecca said, stepping in front of me. Please, just let me talk to him first. I can make him back off. You still have to hear. Incredulous. You can't fix this, Rebecca. You've been trying to handle him for years, and look where that's gotten us. This isn't just about you anymore. It's about our kids, our safety. Before she could argue, I dialed the number. 911. What's your emergency? The words felt like a weight being lifted and dropped at the same time. My name is Michael Carter, I said. I have information about an ongoing fraud investigation involving Nicholas Carter, and I believe my family may be in danger. Rebecca sank into the couch, her face buried in her hands as I gave the dispatcher our address. By the time I hung up, the reality of what I'd done was sinking in. The police were on their way. Nick would be exposed, and Rebecca's involvement might come to light. And while part of me felt relief, another part of me wondered if this would be the final blow to our already crumbling marriage. The sound of sirens echoing down the street made the weight of my decision settle fully on my chest. Rebecca sat frozen on the couch, her face pale and her eyes fixed on the floor. She didn't say a word as the flashing lights spilled into the living room through the window. When the officers knocked, I opened the door, my heart pounding. "Mr. Carter?" One of them asked. I nodded and stepped aside, letting them in. Rebecca stood as they entered, her hands trembling. Is he going to be okay?" she asked, her voice barely audible. The officer frowned. "We're here to make sure you and your family are safe. We'll need statements from both of you." As we sat at the dining table, recounting everything we knew, I could see Rebecca trying to hold herself together. Her voice cracked as she described Nick's manipulative behavior, his demands, and her growing fear that he was spiraling out of control. The officers asked her pointed questions about her involvement in his financial schemes, and I saw her falter, her answers becoming vague and evasive. "I didn't know it was fraud at first," she said repeatedly, her eyes darting between me and the officers. I sat silently, my anger simmering beneath the surface. She was still trying to protect herself, still unwilling to own up to the full extent of her lies. When the questioning was done, one of the officers stood. "We'll be in touch. For now, we recommend both of you stay cautious. If Nicholas Carter contacts you, do not engage. Call us immediately." As they left, Rebecca collapsed into a chair, burying her face in her hands. "This is all falling apart," she whispered. "I didn't want it to come to this, Michael. I thought I could handle it." I stared at her, the weight of everything pressing down on me. "You keep saying that, Rebecca, but the truth is you couldn't handle it. And now our entire family is caught in the fallout." She looked up at me, tears streaming down her face. "I didn't want to lose you," she said, her voice trembling. "I thought if I kept it from you, I could protect what we had." "Protect what?" I snapped. "You've been lying to me for years, keeping secrets, hiding your relationship with Nick. What exactly were you protecting, Rebecca? Because it sure wasn't our marriage." The silence between us was suffocating. For the first time, I didn't see the woman I married. I saw someone I barely recognized, someone who had been living a double life right under my nose. The hours crawled by, each moment heavier than the last. I tried to sleep but couldn't. My mind was a whirlwind of anger, confusion, and dread. Rebecca stayed in the living room, curled up on the couch, her phone clutched tightly in her hand. It was around 2 a.m. when the phone rang. The sharp sound cut through the silence like a knife. Rebecca jolted awake, staring at the screen as it buzzed in her hand. "It's him," she whispered, her voice trembling. My heart raced as I grabbed the phone from her. "Nick," I said, answering the call. There was a long pause on the other end before a voice finally spoke. "Michael," Nick said, his tone calm, almost smug. "I assume Rebecca's told you everything by now." "Not everything," I said coldly, "but enough to know you're a manipulative bastard who's been tearing my family apart." Nick laughed softly. "Family is complicated, isn't it? I didn't mean for things to get out of hand, but Rebecca, she always had a way of bringing out the worst in me." "What do you want?" I demanded. "What I've always wanted," he said smoothly. "Rebecca, she doesn't belong with you, Michael. She never did. She belongs with me." The word sent a chill down my spine. "You're sick," I spat. "Maybe," Nick said, "but you can't stop her from coming to me. She'll choose me, Michael. She always does." The line went dead, and I stared at the phone, my chest heaving. "What did he say?" Rebecca asked, her voice shaking. I turned to her, my anger boiling over. "He thinks you'll choose him," I said, throwing the phone onto the couch. "That's what he wants. And after everything you've done, I'm starting to think he's right." Rebecca's face crumpled, her tears coming in full force. "Michael, no. I made mistakes, but I don't want him. I don't. I want us." "Then prove it," I said, my voice cold. "Cut him out of your life. Completely. Or we're done." She stared at me, her expression a mix of fear and desperation. For the first time, I saw her truly hesitate, and that hesitation told me everything I needed to know. Nick wasn't just a shadow from her past. He was something she couldn't let go of, and maybe never would. The days that followed Nick's chilling phone call were some of the longest of my life. Rebecca and I barely spoke, the house steeped in a silence, so heavy it felt like the walls themselves were pressing down on us. I kept the kids in my parents' house for their safety, claiming it was an extended visit. Rebecca spent most of her time glued to her phone, nervously glancing at it, as if expecting Nick to call again. Every time it buzzed, she jumped, but when I asked who it was, she would brush me off, muttering, "Work," or "just a friend." I didn't believe her. One evening, while she was in the shower, I saw her phone light up on the counter. It wasn't Nick's name on the screen. It was an unknown number. Against my better judgment, I picked it up. The message read, "We need to meet. I can't do this without you." My chest tightened as I stared at the words. I wanted to scream, to storm into the bathroom and demand answers, but I didn't. Instead, I set the phone down and walked out of the house, needing to clear my head before I did something I'd regret. When I came back an hour later, Rebecca was sitting at the kitchen table, her head in her hands. She looked up when I walked in, her face pale. "Michael," she said, her voice trembling. "I need to tell you something." "Go on," I said, crossing my arms. She hesitated, her eyes darting to the phone on the counter. "Nick isn't going to stop," she said finally. He thinks I owe him something, and he's not going to leave me alone until I give it to him." "What does he want?" I demanded. She bit her lip, tears welling up in her eyes. "He wants me to disappear with him, to leave everything behind, our life, the kids, you, and go with him." Her words hit me like a freight train. "And what did you say?" I asked, my voice shaking. "I told him no," she said quickly, her tears falling freely now. "I told him I would never leave you. But, Michael, I don't think he's going to accept that." Her words sent a chill down my spine. Nick wasn't just a threat to my marriage anymore. He was a threat to my family's safety. "We need to go to the police," I said firmly. Rebecca shook her head. "No, you don't understand. If we do that, he'll retaliate. He's not stable, Michael. He'll hurt us." I grabbed her hands, forcing her to look at me. "Rebecca, this ends now. I don't care what he thinks you owe him. I don't care how dangerous he is. I am not letting him destroy our lives." She nodded reluctantly, her fear palpable. "Okay," she whispered. "We'll go tomorrow." But we didn't have to wait that long. That night, I was awoken by the sound of shattering glass. My heart raced as I bolted out of bed, Rebecca sitting up beside me, her eyes wide with terror. "What was that?" she whispered. I didn't answer. Grabbing the baseball bat I kept under the bed, I crept toward the living room, my pulse pounding in my ears. The scene that greeted me when I turned on the light made my blood run cold. Nick was standing in the middle of the room, shards of broken window scattered around him. His eyes were wild, his chest heaving as he clutched a crowbar in one hand. "Nick?" Rebecca screamed from behind me. He turned toward her, a twisted smile spreading across his face. "Becca," he said softly, his voice calm despite the chaos. "I told you we belong together. Get out of my house," I growled, stepping between him and Rebecca. Nick's smile faded, his expression darkening. "She doesn't belong to you," he snarled, raising the crowbar. Before I could react, Rebecca pushed past me, throwing herself between us. "Nick, stop," she cried. "This isn't the way to fix things." "Fix things?" Nick shouted, his voice cracking. "You're the one who broke them. You were supposed to be with me, not him." I reached for my phone, my hands trembling as I dialed 911. But before I could hit call, Nick's gaze snapped to me. "You think you can take her from me?" he spat, his voice dripping with venom. "You're nothing, Michael. Nothing." Rebecca turned to me, her face pale. "Michael, please, just go," she whispered. "Go," I said, incredulous. "I'm not leaving you alone with him." But before I could argue further, Nick lunged forward, grabbing Rebecca's arm. "You're coming with me," he hissed. She struggled, tears streaming down her face. "Nick, let me go." I didn't think. I just acted. Swinging the bat with everything I had, I struck Nick's arm, sending the crowbar clattering to the floor. He cried out in pain, releasing Rebecca as he stumbled back. The sound of approaching sirens filled the air, and Nick's eyes darted toward the door. "This isn't over," he growled before bolting out the broken window. I ran after him, but by the time I got outside, he was gone. When the police arrived moments later, Rebecca was still trembling, clutching her arm where Nick had grabbed her. As the officers took our statements, I couldn't shake the feeling that this was far from over. Nick wasn't just a threat anymore. He was a ticking time bomb, and I had no idea how to stop him before he exploded. The aftermath of Nick's break-in was a blur of flashing lights, police questions, and shattered nerves. Rebecca was still shaking when the officers finished taking our statements, wrapping a blanket around herself as if it could shield her from everything that had just happened. "I'm issuing an APB on Nick Carter," one of the officers told us as they prepared to leave. "He's dangerous, and he's crossed the line into outright criminal behavior. We'll find him." I nodded, barely able to process the words. Nick was out there, and as much as I wanted to believe the police would handle it, I couldn't shake the feeling that he wasn't done with us yet. After the house finally quieted down, Rebecca and I sat in the living room, the tension between us so thick it was suffocating. "I can't believe he did this," she whispered, her voice trembling. I stared at her, my exhaustion giving way to cold anger. "You can't believe it? Rebecca, you've been covering for him, enabling him, lying for him. What did you think was going to happen?" Her eyes filled with tears, but I didn't stop. "This isn't just about him," I continued. "It's about you. You let this spiral out of control, and now our family is in danger because of it. What else are you hiding, Rebecca? What else haven't you told me?" She broke down then, sobbing into her hands. "I didn't know it would get this bad," she choked out. "I thought I could handle him, but I couldn't. I was scared, Michael. I didn't know what to do." "You could have told me," I said, my voice low and steady. "You could have trusted me. But instead, you chose to keep me in the dark, and now look where we are." She didn't respond, and for a long time, we just sat there in silence, the weight of everything pressing down on us. The next day, I called my parents and told them to keep the kids for a while longer. "Is everything okay?" my mom asked, concern evident in her voice. "Not really," I admitted, "but I'll explain everything later." I spent the day cleaning up the mess Nick had left behind. The broken glass, a fitting metaphor for our broken lives. Rebecca stayed in the bedroom, barely coming out except to grab a glass of water or go to the bathroom. That evening, there was a knock at the door. My heart jumped, but when I opened it, it wasn't Nick, it was Sean. "I came as soon as I heard," he said, stepping inside. "What the hell happened?" I filled him in, leaving out no details. By the time I was done, Sean looked as shaken as I felt. "This guy's unhinged," he said. "You need to prepare yourself, Mike. If the cops don't find him soon, he could come back. And who knows what he'll do next?" "I know," I said quietly. I don't know how much more of this I can take." Sean put a hand on my shoulder. "You'll get through it. But you need to think about your next move. Is this marriage even salvageable after everything that's happened?" I glanced toward the bedroom, where Rebecca was still hiding. "I don't know," I admitted. "I honestly don't know." Later that night, Rebecca finally came out of the bedroom. She sat down across from me at the kitchen table, her eyes red and swollen from crying. "I know I've hurt you," she said softly. "And I know I've destroyed the trust we had. But I want to fix this, Michael. I want to fix us." I looked at her, my exhaustion giving way to something colder. "How?" I asked. "How do you fix something like this, Rebecca? How do we come back from this?" She didn't have an answer, and neither did I. The silence between us stretched on, filled with the unspoken truths we were too afraid to confront. I didn't know what the future held, but one thing was clear. The life we'd had was gone, shattered like the window Nick had broken. And I wasn't sure it could ever be put back together. For the first time, I wasn't sure if I even wanted to try.